be off in the viewport but on in the render, or it can be off in the render but on in the viewport. So you've got as much sort of flexibility there as you really need. In other packages like Houdini, I believe that you may get even more flexibility again. You know, you may be able to switch that state dynamically based on certain parameters and so forth, and you can wire things together. But as you can see in Max, you've got a pretty good middle ground. You've got a nice procedural workflow. It's easy to build a stack. Once you have got a stack built, you can obviously instance modifiers in from other objects. You also have the ability to have any modifier be active in the viewport or the render only, or you can have a modifier off or on. And you know, there's a great deal of flexibility there, and it's actually quite a cool system. So before we finish off this chapter, let's have a look at one last topic, and that's collapsing of the stack. Now, collapsing of the stack is where we either bake down all of the modifiers in the stack in their entirety, or up to a certain point in the stack. And I'll show you exactly how that works now. Now, I've got an example here from the next DVD in this series, and it's quite a cool little example. And what we've got is we've got a number of modifiers making up the stack, and they allow us to do this effect. If I go in and get the slice modifier and select the slice plane, I can actually move the slice plane up and down, and you can see that as it moves up and down, the selection is changing here. It's procedurally building the model. It's actually filling in these faces here, and it's then doing a bevel on those faces that it's actually created. And that's all done on the fly, just using features of the stack and the modifiers that we have here. Now, if I just shut that down, there are actually a couple of modifiers here which don't necessarily need to be evaluated every single time we move the slice plane, or if we're running an animation. And because of that, it may be beneficial to actually do what's known as collapsing them, or collapsing to a point, and that will actually remove them from the stack. But we can actually keep all the modifiers above them. So I'll show you what I mean by that. If I go down to the editable mesh, you can see we've got the editable mesh here. Then we've got some UV mapping applied. And then we've got an FFD modifier that comes in and deforms our mesh a little bit. Then we've got edit poly modifier, which actually allows us to, you know, model our object or whatever. Then we've got a slice, which comes in and cuts our mesh off up to a certain point. We then cap these holes, these open holes here. Then we use a volume select to actually select these new faces, and then we use a face extrude to add our bevel on. Now, the face extrude is needed to be procedural, as is the volume select. The cap holes exactly the same. The slices as well. But the edit poly modifier doesn't actually really do anything in our particular example. So we could just turn that off if we wanted to, or just remove it. The FFD actually does deform our mesh slightly. The UV mapping modifier adds UV mapping coordinates, so we don't want to actually lose the benefit of that from our stack in this particular case. But they're being re-evaluated every single time we move that slice plane, so it's actually slowing down the execution. So what we can do is we can actually go up to the point where we want to collapse our stack. That will actually collapse it back down to this base object type here, which is an editable mesh. And we can right click on our stack, and we can go to the collapse options. Now, we've got two options here, and this tick box, which actually will maintain any custom attributes that we actually have on our object. And you can see the two options are collapse to and collapse all. Now, collapse all will actually just collapse the entire stack, and we'll just end up with a single editable mesh base object. And in this case, that will actually lose everything. So if I do that, you get a warning, which obviously you can disable here. And it's just basically telling us this will remove everything in the stack, including creation parameters and any animation applied to the creation and modifier parameters. Are you sure you want to continue? It's quite a serious warning in that obviously you are removing all those elements, and you may not want to do that. In this case we do, so I'll say yes. And as I said, we end up with the base geometry types at the top of the stack as it's evaluated, and that's an editable poly. So as you saw at the beginning, it was an editable mesh, and then as the stack is evaluated at the top, it's converted to an editable poly. and that's what we end up with when we collapse the stack. Now, I don't want that, so we'll just undo that. What I want to actually do is I want to actually collapse up until the edit poly. So we'll do that. We'll right click and we'll say collapse to. We get the same warning, you know, are you sure you want to do this, blah, blah, blah. We say yes. And now you can see we're left with an editable poly at this point in the stack. Effectively, all the modifiers up until the point where we collapse to are now baked into that editable poly. The UV mapping is preserved. The deformation of the FFD is preserved. And the editable poly conversion is preserved in that our base object is now an editable poly. So it's quite a fundamental thing when you collapse either to or collapse all. And another way of actually collapsing all is, if I just undo that, another thing you can actually do is just do a convert, and that's pretty much the same as actually collapsing all. The only difference is you're not actually collapsing to the base object type at the top of the stack. You're actually collapsing to whatever type of geometry that you choose here. So I can start with an editable mesh, as you can see here. I can actually end up with an editable mesh. As you can see, I can just collapse everything to an editable mesh. Now, the advantage of actually doing this, the reason why you actually have the option of collapsing all, is that sometimes you want to pass on an object to another person, or you want to basically simplify it in its stack. To take out a lot of complication in the stack, to take out a lot of redundant evaluation, you can do a collapse action and take out all of those redundant modifiers and just bake down your mesh into an editable mesh, editable poly, whatever it is that you want to bake it down into. So as you can see, it's quite a fundamental thing to actually collapse to or do a conversion of your mesh to a base object type. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. Let's move on now to the next chapter.